Um, Thanks everyone for joining us. Work obviously does mean the opportunity for not only purposeful life, but one that brings in cash, money, and all of the thing that that entails. We were lucky enough, of course, to get some funding from ANZ to look at the financial well-being of autistic people, which was published. That report was published almost this time last year, I think.
About a year ago.
About a year ago. Gabrielle Hall was one of the researchers on that particular project. And I guess it was a bit of a landmark bit of work because I don't think anyone had really looked at the topic of money and how that affects autistic people.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but perhaps maybe just start with telling us a little bit about what you think financial well-being means to you.
For sure. So I'll be reading. So I have a quiet voice. I've had a cold. So if you can't hear me, please let me know.
Or come to the front.
Yeah. So for me, money is actually sometimes quite dry and boring and abstract. So that's actually something that led me to want to be a part of the studies because I wanted to understand more about my experience of money, but also get underneath actually how that impacts my life as an autistic person, but also as my children get older, how this is going to work out and pan out for them. So money often for me is a bunch of sort of random numbers and it's quite boring. But I think when you get into the human experience of money and what money brings into our lives, it actually gets a lot more interesting. So money gives us the opportunity to be safe and warm or cool in our home. It's to eat enough and well enough to be well. It's to have the time and energy to move our bodies in healthy ways. And in some ways, health is a privilege of the rich. And, you know, I was a nurse naturopath and that was very much a big part of the teachings that we had is that certain people with their postcodes have better health outcomes, and this is what drove me particularly to be involved with this study. So money helps us get the support that we need to be who we want to be and the freedom to make those choices and to study to expand our minds but also our employment options as well, and that's why we're all here today. It also gives us the opportunity to relax, have fun with our loved ones in ways that we choose. There's a lot of things about neurodiversity is that often what we like isn't what the non-autistic world likes. So it's hard when you've got a world that's set up for people who have different bodies and brains. So if we've got money, we get to choose what works for us. And it also gives us the time and the energy to give back in ways that we want to. There's a lot of strong social justice ideology in the autistic world, and you can only do that really when you have enough already yourself. It's also having peace of mind that, you know, we have enough ourselves, but that our children will. A big part of the study was looking at carers, and a massive issue for carers was they were very frightened for their children's outcome when they didn't have the capacity to look after them. And so what's important for me, again, is that generationally, I think the work that's happening today isn't just for the autistic adults of today, but also our children as well, and that's what's so important. And so for me, financial well-being is just about being comfortable and having choice, and I think that's the same for anyone. But that's what I think, but society often has quite a different angle. So money gives you social visibility, it gives you status, it gives you acceptance, and it's easier to feel good about yourself when society tells you that you are acceptable because of what you do or how you do it. So being autistic and not having a lot of money isn't always a great place to be. And money speaks, money has power, money talks. You know, we're in a large organisation that has massive influence in our country, and again, it's a privilege for us to be here. So money can't buy happiness, but it can actually make it a lot easier and quicker to come by.
At the launch, I remember you talking about status and that it's not necessarily the case that autistic people are pursuing money for the purpose of status.
Absolutely.
So it's you want to talk a little bit about that status, that stuff?
Yeah, I'll speak a bit about that later, but like autistic people, you know, as a gross generalisation, because we're also diverse, are generally very egalitarian. So when I worked in the corporate world myself, if the CEO came and said hello, that was the same as the cleaner. Anyone's lovely. If they're friendly and happy to chat, I'm happy to chat. So, and often autistic people don't align themselves for social advantage. We align ourselves for, comfort and integrity. And it's just a different way of approaching being with people.
Thanks. So could you tell us a little bit about what the key findings from that study were?
Yep, great. So I've focused mainly on the key findings for autistic people. There was a lot about carers, but that's a different story. So what they found is that there are low levels of income and limited employment opportunities, and they were the primary drivers of financial hardship, and that's why we're all here today. So thank you all for being here today. Autism and autistic families are grappling with significant financial challenges due to their additional extensive health and living costs. If you don't have NDIA for your autistic child, it's a phenomenal expense to outlay the services that you need to build capacity for your children, let alone being an autistic adult who requires services that don't actually exist. So that's all building slowly. That autistic people were often more vulnerable to financial exploitation, and that there's often a co-occurring element of obsessive compulsive disorder. And that was a challenge not only to the financial well-being, but also overall well-being. And that can be obsessive, rigid thinking, or quite loose, flexible thinking, and being impulsive as well. So something that I didn't know anything about was financial socialization, and that's the way that families talk about money, that society talks about money, that friends talk about money, and that wasn't something that I was aware of. But we have limited exposure in that way, which actually limits our knowledge to build capacity for ourselves financially. So autistic participants were interested in learning more about financial decisions and understanding debt, avoiding scams, choosing a bank account, understanding superannuation, knowing about consumer rights, and planning for the future and making investments. So, and everyday issues such as paying rent, tax and hexes. So that really everyday stuff that that might just be a natural rites of passage in terms of knowledge for a neurotypical person, can be quite challenging for an autistic person for many different reasons. So the participants were concerned that they wouldn't be able to understand conventional financial information due to their neurodiversity, and sometimes the paperwork in and of itself is a barrier, and I find that myself particularly. And they also can be quite overwhelmed by the way information is presented. And what was most confronting to me with the findings of the research is that the neurodiversity of autism, the way with which our brains function differently, actually is a challenge for us being in the world shaped for people unlike ourselves. So self-exclusion became a really big issue. And as our wonderful professor wrote very eloquently, when the environment and social structures of work, consumption and leisure make participation unpleasant and stressful, this invokes unintentional discrimination. And this really hit home for me, because in so many ways I'd done this all my life, and I was quite saddened that this had happened to a lot more people, but also quite relieved it wasn't just me. And this is what's so fantastic for an adult autistic identity, is that you get to look at what the challenges are in context of neurology, not in context of your own identity. But we met some amazing people, incredibly diverse, incredibly determined to know more, very determined to be independent, and they were inspiring and really, really wonderful people.
Interesting. One of the things that you said was potentially being vulnerable to scams.
Yeah.
I know I've been caring for my mother recently, and just how many phone calls come in now from people trying to scam.
Yeah.
She doesn't have a computer at the home, and
No.
she's a trusting soul, so she's kind of a little bit unclear as to why people are telling her that her internet is down, but she keeps on trying to work out whether it's the other telephone or something. I'm just wanting to know, what do you think, if we did some research into scamming, would autistic people be a little bit more, would there be a higher rate, do you think?
Look, apparently statistically there is. When the media were wanting to interview me or other people around that, I couldn't find anyone who had been, but there were certainly significant stories about that in the research. But part of what I was saying before about that egalitarian way with which we interact. I call us, we're very authentically earnest, and there's a very trusting nature that we have, and that can absolutely be used against us when, what looks like a gas man may not be a gas man. So I think there is a higher risk, and I'm sure it would be found.
Yeah. So we've talked about some of the, some of those findings. Perhaps could you talk a little bit about what are some of the autistic strengths?
Yeah, for sure.
And characteristics that actually would be helpful in increasing financial well-being or supporting financial well-being?
For sure. And what's so exciting about the strengths of autistic people, often they're strengths of autistic adults who are newly diagnosed and unstudied. And so the literature doesn't reflect our strengths a lot of the time. It reflects deficits of children. So it's really great to have the opportunity to talk about autistic strengths. So we're often really good at visual and creative thinking, and we can come up with unique and novel ways to create intrinsic motivation and also sustainable processes, because financial literacy and wellbeing is really, it is a marathon, not a sprint. It's got to be ongoing, positive and appropriate behaviours. So there was one wonderful young man who's had a big shift for himself in his own life through his own empowerment, and one of those aspects is managing money as a student. So he actually gamifies his savings, and he gave himself goals and targets that he uses games in his head to actually achieve those. And in terms of financial socialization, what was brilliant is he actually taught his younger brother that as well. So his strengths became a family strength, and he was a great example. And as I was saying that before, we can often be quite earnest and dedicated and loyal, and this is actually very helpful. And amongst that, we're also quite tenacious and persistent. And a beautiful example of this was a young woman who was in the study, and her father, who was in the study as a carer, divide her financial tasks. So between them, they negotiate, I'm managing now, I'll do it. I'm not managing now, you do it. And, this is no easy thing for them to have achieved, because they've had a very tumultuous relationship, but their loyalty to each other was amazing, and their commitment and their tenacity to also navigate a bank to make that work for them was massive, because, around legalities, it's really big. And what I found even more impressive is that she's an art student, and she's determined to create art that celebrates her autism. And together, her and her dad spent 2 years resourcing the partners and the funds to actually make a movie reflective of one of her projects. And I was lucky enough to be a part of that. It was wonderful and creative. But together, they created something really, really magical. So some autistic people have excellent pattern perception and detailed analytical thinking. I think the guys that are working at ANZ now are showing the strength and the absolute value of this fabulous way of thinking. And that can help us assess financial products and plans, what's a best feature, not what a good feature, and make well-informed decisions. And it can also make sure that our decisions sometimes are not emotional. So if you're trying to budget and if you have big expenditures, sometimes non-emotional financial decisions can be really good ones. So one more, because I could go on, but we've only got a certain amount of time. And this is what we were saying before, is that we are often very true to our beliefs and our values, and increasing our social status isn't that important. So in terms of our expenditure, what we found is that people didn't spend money on items that increase their social standing. They spent money on items that increase their independence and autonomy, and I think that's quite a different way of thinking. So there's lots of strengths, and they can all be used extremely well if you listen and ask an autistic person. Because of our neurodiversity, you can't assume what works for one person will work for another. So if you've got an autistic person in front of you, they probably know themselves really well. Just use their information to actually get it to work for them.
Thanks. So probably just one last thing to ask. Mm-hmm. I guess since being involved in that study, what have you learnt about your own financial well-being?
Yeah, one of the motivations for going to study is I'm crap at money, and And I really wanted to understand that better, but also develop skills to make my life easier and my family. So I realised that I would say I go through the same life stages as most other non-autistic adults, but I probably went through them later, which means that my financial growth was probably later than expected. And as I've gotten older, the finances have become much more complicated. So when I was a student, I had 2 accounts. I didn't have much money anyway, and that was really easy. But now, you know, married, children, mortgages, insurance, taxes, it all just got totally overcomplicated for me. And that means that my husband now does all the money. And I'm not really comfortable with that, but it works. And what was really great about the research was going, okay, this isn't just me, there's a reason this is the case, and I want to make a difference in this. So that was really empowering. And something that I am, like other autistic people, is either very sort of impulsive or very rigid. So about savings, I can be very, very strict about savings and save incredibly well, or I can be totally compulsive. So at the moment I've got sort of a knitting wool thing happening, and you know, that's a compulsion that I have. And lucky it's not too expensive, but I've noticed and observed that that's a pattern of autistic people. But really what hit home in the research is employment was really the trickiest aspect for me. I can teach myself how to have these financial skills with the right knowledge, but in terms of engaging in the workforce, not having the appropriate social skills, not having the appropriate knowledge around power dynamics, around how businesses really works on relationships, and I didn't understand that. I thought I went to work to do a job. I didn't realise I went to work to be a part of a group and a community, and that obviously didn't go down well in many different ways in many different times. So in terms of that self-exclusion, I opted out of the workforce after I had 2 children. It was too hard. But what's been so fantastic about being a part of the research, I can now look at all of that information objectively, reflect on my capacity, what I can do, what I can't do, and also know around that financial socialisation. I can have these conversations with my kids now in relation to their autism, but also in around these systems. So it's been fantastic.
I don't think a lot of people talk about finance with their families.
No, they don't.
And there was a report published last year where I think Australia scored 59, so 59 out of 100 as an average of our financial well-being, which I think in many European countries is kind of hitting 65, 70 plus. So, so there's a lot of work to go for the neurotypical population. So that probably just wraps us up. Thank you very much for coming and hearing about it. We've got the potential to expand on this research with ANZ, so we'll be finding out about that over the next couple of months, and Gabby will be part of that as well. So thank you very much for your time.